Hi all, welcome to Physio Exam Buddy. This is a last minute revision video of the phases of gastric secretion and regulation. The high yield concepts explained in a very simple way. Phases of gastric secretion. It is broadly divided into four phases, that is cephalic phase, gastric phase, intestinal phase and an interdigestive phase. Cephalic phase, that is the secretion of the gastric juice, occurs before the food even enters into the stomach, and that phase it is known as the cephalic phase. And the secretion happening when the food enters the stomach, it is the gastric phase. And when the partially digested food from enters the duodenum from the stomach, the gastric secretion again occurs in the stomach, and which is known as the intestinal phase. And in between these also certain secretion occurs in the stomach, and that phase is coming under the interdigestive phase. We will see in detail the different phases. First, about cephalic phase, that is cephalic phase, that is the gastric secretion. It occurs before the food reaches the stomach. It can be either due to the thought of the food, sight, smell of the appetizing food, and the reason for this secretion is because of a conditioned reflex. And the secretion can also happen if you place the food in the mouth, that is the taste of the food will produce the secretion in the stomach, and it is because of the unconditioned reflex. So the cephalic phase, it is mainly mediated entirely by a vagus nerve, and during this phase 30% of the gastric secretion happens. Now about the pathway, how the cephalic phase occurs. That is the cerebral cortex as well as the appetite centers present in the amygdala and the hypothalamus is responsible for the cephalic phase, and these centers will send neurogenic signals into the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve will get stimulated producing secretions in the stomach, and it causes direct stimulation of the parietal cells which will increase the gastric secretion. Also, the vagus nerves can indirectly stimulate the G cells to secrete the gastrin. Next, about the vagal stimulation in detail. This vagal stimulation, it will actually increases the HCl secretion. It is by two mechanisms. That is, first one is by releasing a peptide which is known as the gastrin releasing peptide or GRP, which will increase the gastrin secretion and thereby the acid secretion in the stomach. And the next mechanism is by the release of acetylcholine, thereby increasing the HCl secretion. Again, the psychological states as well as the emotional state of a person can also affect the gastric secretions as well as motility. And this is basically mediated by the vagus nerve. And physician named as William Mount observed these things in a patient named as Alexis Saint Martin. And he got a permanent gastric fistula which results from a gunshot wound. And in this patient, the anger and hostility, it actually found to increase the gastric secretion and as well as motility, whereas fear and depression, it causes a decrease in the gastric secretion, blood flow as well as motility. And next experiment which helps to prove the cephalic phase is the chance feeding or Pavlov's experiment. That is, it will demonstrate the gastric juice secretion during the cephalic phase in a dog. So a hole, it is made in the neck of an anesthetist dog. Whenever the dog eats food, the secretion will come and the food will come out through the cut end of the esophagus. So the food is not going into the stomach, but the dog has a satisfaction of eating, and a Pavlov's pouch is also created with a fistula from the stomach which opens to the exterior. So whenever the dog eats food, the food will be coming out through this opening, whereas it's not reaching into the stomach. But even if the food is not reaching in the stomach, the stomach is found to produce the gastric secretion. The same animal after vagotomy, there is no gastric secretion, which again proves that the vagus nerve is the one which mediates the cephalic phase of gastric secretion. Now about the second phase, that is the gastric phase. That is when the food, when it reaches the stomach, it increases the gastric secretion. And during this phase, almost 70% of the gastric secretion happens. And there are two mechanisms which regulate the gastric phase. First one is a neural mechanism and the second one is a hormonal mechanism. Neural mechanisms include local enteric reflexes as well as long vagovagal reflex. And under the hormone, you have to explain the gastrin, which will be stimulated by the protein digestion projects which stimulate the G cells to produce this gastrin. So first we will see the neural mechanism or the neural regulation of the gastric phase. First about the local enteric reflexes. Whenever the food enters the stomach, it will produce a stretch as well as chemical stimuli, which will stimulate the receptors which is present in the walls of the stomach as well as mucosa, which will send impulses via our submucosal plexus, which will synapse on the postganglionic parasympathetic neurons, which is present in the parietal cells, and this will actually stimulate the acid secretion. So that is about the local enteric reflexes. And the next is about the long vagovagal reflex. That is when the sensory impulses reaches or stimulate the vagus will send impulses into the brainstem, and from the brainstem efferent impulses will reach again via the same nerve, that is the vagus, and reaches the stomach, and it is found to increase the gastric juice secretion. Next about the third phase, that is intestinal phase. That is when the food reaches the upper part of the small intestine. That is presence of the food in the upper small intestine, especially the duodenum. It will produce gastric secretion. And during this phase, only very small amount, that is 10% of the gastric juice will be secreted. And later the food, there occurs an inhibition of this gastric secretion also by our enterogastric reflex as well as certain GI hormones. First, about the enterogastric reflex. That reflex occurs when the food reaches the small intestine, and it is mediated by our myenteric nerves in the enteric nervous system as well as the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves, especially the vagus. This enterogastric reflex actually inhibits the gastric secretion or the stomach secretion. Next, about the hormonal mechanisms or the hormones which causes an inhibition in the secretion of the gastric juice during the intestinal phase. That is basically the acid, fat as well as protein breakdown products or hyper or hypoosmotic solution and irritating factors which is present in the food when it reaches the small intestine, which will produce the secretion of certain hormones like secretin, cholecystokinin, gastrointestinal peptide, vasoactive intestinal peptide, somatostatin as well as peptide YY. Next is about the last phase, that is the interdigestive phase, where the basal secretion happens. That is, in between the food intake also small amount of the gastric secretion happens, and it is only very few ml per hour, and this secretion basically composed of mucus, small amount of protein or the pepsin, and almost no acid will be present in this interdigestive phase. And an emotional stimuli is found to increase the secretion, and that secretion will be rich in high amount of acid as well as pepsin. So that's about the interdigestive phase. So in short, the cephalic phase, which is under the control of the neuron or vagus nerve. Gastric phase, again neural control as well as hormonal control. Under neuron, you have to explain the local enteric reflexes as well as the vasovagal reflex. Under the hormones, mainly certain hormones, especially the gastrin. And in the intestinal phase, the regulation is mainly by the enterogastric reflex as well as certain inhibitory hormones. So please remember, in the intestinal phase, it is the inhibition of the gastric secretion happening. Thank you.